Mariupol, 85 days that changed the world. Welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about Mariupol, a city that endured 85 days of siege warfare in the spring of 2022, becoming a symbol of resistance, suffering, and the terrible cost of modern conflict. This is a story of a city caught between empires, of defenders who refused to surrender, of civilians trapped in unimaginable circumstances, and of a siege that captured the world's attention even as it unfolded in the digital age. It is a story that demands to be told with care, with respect for those who lived through it, and with an understanding that history was being written in real time through the rubble of apartment buildings and the steel corridors of an industrial fortress. Take a moment to settle in. Pour yourself something warm to drink. Find a comfortable place where you can listen without distraction. This is not a story that rushes. It is one that deserves our full attention, our empathy, and our willingness to understand how an ancient port city on the Azov Sea became the defining battlefield of the early 21st century's return to great power conflict. The city before the storm. To understand what happened during those 85 days, we must first understand what Mariupol was before the world knew its name. We must walk its streets in peacetime, know its people, and comprehend why this particular city became so important that both sides were willing to sacrifice so much for its control. Mariupol sits on the northern shore of the Azov Sea, at the mouth of the Kalmius River. It is a city of approximately 450,000 people, or was before the war. The city has always occupied a precarious position, geographically and politically. To the west lies the rest of Ukraine. To the east, just 50 kilometers away, lies the Russian border. To the south, across the sea, lies Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014. To the north lies the Donbass, the industrialized heartland where separatist forces backed by Russia had been fighting Ukrainian forces since that same year. The city's history is one of constant transformation. Founded in 1778 by Greek settlers fleeing the Ottoman Empire, it was named after the Virgin Mary. Over the centuries, it became a major industrial center, particularly after the discovery of rich iron ore deposits in the region. By the Soviet era, Mariupol, then called Zhdanov, had become one of the USSR's steel-producing capitals. The Azovstal and Ilyich steel plants employed tens of thousands of workers and produced millions of tons of steel each year. But Mariupol was more than its steel mills. It was a cosmopolitan city, a melting pot where Ukrainians, Russians, Greeks, Jews, and others lived side by side. Russian was the predominant language on the streets, but Ukrainian identity had been growing stronger, particularly after the Euromaidan Revolution of 2014. The city had its beaches, its parks, its theatres. Families gathered at the Primorsky Boulevard to watch the sunset over the sea. Children played in the city's numerous playgrounds. Students attended the state university. Life, in other words, was ordinary, mundane, peaceful, the kind of peace we only recognize in retrospect, when it has been shattered. After 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatists in the Donbass, Mariupol found itself on the front line. The separatists briefly controlled parts of the city in the spring of 2014, but Ukrainian forces, including the Azov Battalion, recaptured it. The city then became a crucial defensive position, the westernmost point of Ukrainian control along the Azov Sea coast. It was the gateway between Russian-held territory and the rest of Ukraine, a strategic prize that could open or close land access to Crimea. For 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, Mariupol lived in a state of uneasy tension. The war was close. Sometimes you could hear the artillery. But it was not here. The city rebuilt, adapted, endured. Internally displaced persons from the occupied territories moved in. The Ukrainian military fortified positions around the city. Checkpoints became part of daily life. But still, people worked, studied, fell in love, raised children. Life continued because life always continues, until it cannot. By early 2022, intelligence reports were warning of a massive Russian military buildup on Ukraine's borders. In Mariupol, as elsewhere in Ukraine, people watched nervously but hoped for the best. Many simply could not believe that a full-scale invasion would happen. This was the 21st century. The world was too interconnected, too modern, too civilized for total war to return to Europe. Those who had lived through the fighting in 2014 remembered the terror, but even they hoped it would not come again. They were wrong. Fund, the first days, February 24th to 28th, 2022. On February 24th, 2022, at approximately 5:00 a.m. local time, Russia launched what it called a special military operation against Ukraine. It was, by any reasonable definition, a full-scale invasion involving more than 150,000 troops attacking from multiple directions, from Belarus in the north, from Russia in the east, from Crimea in the south. For Mariupol, the war arrived almost immediately, though not in the form of troops at the gates. That morning, as dawn broke over the Azov Sea, residents woke to the sound of explosions. Russian forces were striking military targets across the city with missiles and artillery. Air raid sirens wailed. People rushed to gather emergency supplies, to make phone calls to loved ones, to try to understand what was happening. The initial Russian strategy appeared to be a rapid advance on multiple fronts, with the goal of quickly capturing major cities and forcing the Ukrainian government to capitulate. In the south, Russian forces poured out of Crimea, moving north toward Kherson and northwest along the coast toward Mariupol. From the east, forces from the Donetsk separatist region began advancing westward. Mariupol's defenders consisted of several units. The 36th Separate Marine Brigade, professional soldiers of Ukraine's naval infantry, held key positions in and around the city. The Azov Regiment, which had begun as a volunteer battalion in 2014 and been integrated into the National Guard, was responsible for defending the eastern approaches. The 12th Operational Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine also had forces in the city. Various territorial defense units, civilians who had taken up arms, supplemented these professional forces. In total, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Ukrainian fighters would defend the city, though exact numbers remain uncertain. The defenders faced overwhelming odds. Russian forces approaching Mariupol numbered in the tens of thousands, supported by artillery, tanks, and air power. Additionally, units from the Donetsk People's Republic militia were involved in the assault. The attackers had one crucial advantage. They could surround the city, cutting it off from resupply and reinforcement. In those first days, Ukrainian forces fought to hold the approaches to the city. The villages and towns around Mariupol became battlefields. Sartana, Talakivka, Lebedinske, places few outside the region had heard of, became sites of desperate combat. The defenders were trying to buy time, hoping that Ukrainian forces advancing from elsewhere might break through, that the situation might somehow change. By February 28th, just 4 days after the invasion began, Russian and separatist forces had effectively surrounded Mariupol, cutting off the main road westward toward Zaporizhzhia. The city was now under siege. Some civilians had managed to evacuate in those first days, fleeing west in cars packed with belongings. But the majority, hundreds of thousands of people, remained trapped. Those who stayed made difficult calculations. Some believed the siege would be short. Some had nowhere to go. Some had elderly relatives who could not travel. Some simply refused to abandon their homes, their city, their lives. Many would later wish they had left when they could. But hindsight is a luxury not afforded to those living through history's darkest moments. The siege begins March 1st to 10, 2022. When people think of sieges, they often imagine medieval affairs, castles surrounded, catapults launching stones, defenders atop walls. Modern siege warfare is different, but no less terrible. It is fought with artillery and rockets, with tanks and drones, with missiles that can strike from dozens of kilometers away. And it is fought, inevitably, among civilians, in apartment buildings and hospitals, in schools and shelters. As March began, Russian forces tightened their grip around Mariupol. The strategy was clear: isolate, bombard, assault. Cut off the city from resupply and reinforcement. Pound it with artillery until resistance crumbles. Then move in and secure it, block by block, building by building. It is a strategy as old as warfare itself, updated with modern weapons, but unchanged in its fundamental brutality. The bombardment intensified dramatically. Russian artillery and rocket systems, multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, howitzers, mortars, began systematic shelling of the city. At first, the strikes focused on military targets, checkpoints, strongpoints, suspected command posts. But very quickly, the bombardment expanded to hit civilian infrastructure: apartment buildings, power plants, water treatment facilities, heating plants. This was not accidental. In modern siege warfare, attacking infrastructure serves multiple purposes. It demoralizes defenders and civilians alike. It makes life in the besieged city progressively more unbearable, increasing pressure to surrender. It degrades the defender's ability to coordinate and communicate, and it sends a message: resistance is futile. Only surrender brings relief. For the people of Mariupol, life transformed overnight from normal urban existence to a nightmare of survival. First, the power went out, then the water. Gas supplies for heating, crucial in the Ukrainian march, when temperatures still hover around freezing, were cut. Cell phone networks failed. Internet access disappeared. The city was not just under siege, it was cut off from the world. Families moved into basements and bomb shelters. The basements of Soviet-era apartment buildings designed as fallout shelters during the Cold War now served their original purpose. Hundreds of people crowded into dark, cold, damp spaces, sitting on wet concrete, huddling together for warmth. They had no light except candles and flashlights, no heat, no running water, no way to cook food except over improvised fires, no communication with the outside world. No idea how long this would last. Food became scarce almost immediately. The shops had been stripped bare in the first days of the war. Now, there was no way for supplies to enter the city. Families rationed whatever they had: bread, canned goods, cereals. They melted snow for water. They cooked over fires made from broken furniture. They shared what little they had with neighbors, with strangers, because in extremity, people often discover reserves of kindness they didn't know they possessed. The shelling was relentless. It came at all hours, day and night. Sometimes it was targeted. You could see the trajectory, predict where the next shell might land. Other times it seemed random, indiscriminate. A building would be hit and collapse, burying families in rubble. People learned to distinguish between incoming and outgoing fire, between the whistle of artillery shells and the whoosh of rockets. They learned which buildings offered the best protection, where the shelters were, how to move through the city, avoiding open spaces and sniper positions. Medical care deteriorated rapidly. Hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties. Soldiers wounded in combat, civilians hit by shelling, people with chronic conditions whose medications had run out. Doctors and nurses worked by candlelight, without anesthesia without proper instruments, often without electricity to power life-saving equipment. They performed amputations with handsaws. They used vodka as disinfectant. They made terrible decisions about who could be saved and who could not, knowing that their resources were finite and diminishing every day. The Ukrainian defenders fought back as best they could. They launched counterattacks against Russian positions. They used anti-tank weapons to destroy armored vehicles. They set ambushes and conducted raids. They moved through the city using underground passages, tunnels, and buildings to avoid aerial surveillance. They were professional soldiers and motivated volunteers, and they were defending their home. But they were also vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcement. By March 10, about 2 weeks into the siege, Mariupol had already suffered catastrophic damage. Entire neighborhoods were in ruins. Thousands of civilians were dead or wounded. The humanitarian situation was desperate. And yet, the siege was only beginning. The worst was still to come. Hell on Earth, March 11th, 2022. There are moments in war that crystallize horror, that reduce the vast tragedy of conflict to a single event so terrible that it pierces through the numbing effect of daily violence. For Mariupol, one such moment came on March 16th, 2022, when a Russian airstrike hit the Mariupol Drama Theatre. The theatre, a beautiful building in the city centre with a distinctive colonnade facade, had become a shelter for hundreds of civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly people. They huddled in the theatre's basement and halls, seeking safety in a building they hoped would be spared. Outside the theatre, in letters large enough to be seen from the air, survivors had written "children" in Russian, "Diti," on the O pavement in front and back, a desperate plea for mercy, an attempt to signal that this was a civilian shelter. On the afternoon of March 16th, a Russian aircraft dropped what was likely a 500-kilogram bomb on the theatre. The massive explosion destroyed much of the building. The center section collapsed, burying people under tons of concrete and steel. The exact death toll will probably never be known with certainty. Ukrainian authorities estimated approximately 300 people were killed. Some estimates run higher. Bodies remained under the rubble for weeks. Some were never recovered. The destruction of the drama theatre epitomized the siege of Mariupol. It showed that there were no safe spaces, no sanctuaries. It showed that attempts to protect civilians were futile. It showed that the world was watching but not intervening. And it showed that this was not a surgical military operation, but a war of annihilation against a city and its people. But the drama theatre, as horrific as it was not the only atrocity during those days. The maternity and children's hospital was bombed on March 9th, killing and wounding mothers, babies, medical staff. The images of a wounded pregnant woman being carried out on a stretcher spread around the world. She and her baby later died. The hospital, like the theatre, was clearly marked as a medical facility. It was bombed anyway. Apartment buildings were destroyed not in isolated strikes, but systematically. Residential districts became moonscapes of rubble and twisted metal. The Church of the Intercession, with its distinctive dome, was damaged. Schools, kindergartens, administrative buildings, all came under fire. The city's infrastructure was not just damaged, but deliberately destroyed. Water treatment plants, electrical substations, gas lines, communication towers. The civilian death toll mounted into the thousands. Bodies lay in the streets, frozen and uncollected. In some cases, there were too many dead to bury properly. In some cases, the shelling was too intense to risk going outside for burial. In some cases, the ground was too frozen to dig graves. Families buried their loved ones in yards, in parks, in shallow graves marked with crude wooden crosses, or plastic bottles with names written on paper tucked inside. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Children who had once played in parks and attended school now cowered in basements, traumatized by the constant explosions. Adults who had led ordinary lives, teachers, engineers, shop clerks, doctors, now faced daily decisions about survival. Whether to risk leaving the shelter to search for food, whether to drink contaminated water, or go thirsty, whether to try to flee or stay and hope the nightmare would end. Communication with the outside world became nearly impossible. Some people managed to send brief messages when they could find spots with cell service, usually by climbing to upper floors of damaged buildings, risking sniper fire for a few moments of connection. These messages were desperate, pleas for help, descriptions of hell, goodbyes to loved ones. Then the connection would drop, and they would return to the basement, to the cold and dark and fear. The Ukrainian defenders continued to fight. They held strategic buildings and strongpoints throughout the city. They used the urban terrain to their advantage, turning apartment blocks into fortresses, using underground passages for movement, conducting hit-and-run attacks against Russian positions. They were determined not to let Mariupol fall without a fight. But they were also realistic. Without reinforcement, without resupply, they knew they could not hold forever. The question was how long they could last, and how many Russian forces they could tie down, preventing them from being used elsewhere in Ukraine. Russian and separatist forces gradually pushed into the city from multiple directions. The eastern districts fell first, then the northern neighborhoods. The fighting was brutal and close quarter, building to building, room to room. Urban combat is among the most difficult and costly types of warfare. Every building is a potential fortress. Every street corner is a potential ambush site. Attackers suffer heavy casualties even when they have overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. By March 20th, Russian forces controlled perhaps half of the city, but resistance remained fierce. The city centre, including the drama theatre ruins, was contested. The southwestern districts near the sea remained under Ukrainian control. And rising above the southern part of the city, dominating the landscape with its towers and smokestacks, stood the Azovstal steel plant, soon to become the last bastion of Ukrainian defence and the symbol of Mariupol's resistance. The humanitarian catastrophe, March 21-31, 2022. While the military battle raged, another catastrophe was unfolding, the humanitarian crisis affecting hundreds of thousands of trapped civilians. By late March, Mariupol had become what humanitarian organizations describe as a besieged population under attack. A worst-case scenario where civilians are both trapped in a combat zone and deliberately targeted. The conditions in the basements and bomb shelters were deteriorating from merely horrible to genuinely life-threatening. Without heat, temperatures hovered barely above freezing. Without running water, people were forced to melt snow or draw water from contaminated sources. Without electricity, there was no light, no way to charge phones, no way to get information. Without food supplies, people were beginning to starve. The elderly and the sick died first, as they always do in humanitarian disasters. People with diabetes who could not get insulin. People with heart conditions who had no medication. People who simply could not survive the cold, the hunger, the stress. Children and infants were particularly vulnerable. There were reports of babies dying from dehydration and malnutrition. Mothers unable to breastfeed because they themselves were starving. Parents making impossible decisions about how to allocate what little food remained. Disease began to spread. In crowded, unsanitary shelters, infectious diseases proliferate rapidly. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal illnesses, skin conditions. Without medical care, these conditions that would normally be minor became life-threatening. Without clean water, cholera and dysentery became risks. Without heat, hypothermia was a constant danger. The psychological trauma was profound. Imagine living for weeks in a dark basement, listening to explosions, not knowing if each moment might be your last. Not knowing if your relatives in other parts of the city are alive or dead. Not knowing when or if relief will come. Not knowing if there is still a world outside, if anyone remembers you, if anyone cares. This is not merely fear. It is a kind of existential horror that rewrites a person's understanding of the world and their place in it. Various attempts were made to establish humanitarian corridors, agreements between Ukrainian and Russian forces to allow civilians to evacuate safely. Most of these attempts failed. Buses sent to evacuate people were turned back. Convoys were shelled. Temporary ceasefires collapsed within hours or minutes. Both sides blamed the other. The truth, probably, is that the situation was so chaotic, the command and control so fragmented, and the incentives so misaligned that effective humanitarian access was nearly impossible. Some civilians did manage to escape. Small groups would attempt to flee during lulls in the fighting, driving out of the city through checkpoints, navigating minefields and destroyed roads, hoping they would not be shot or shelled. These journeys were terrifying. Families packed into cars, driving past corpses and burning buildings, not knowing if they would make it. Many did not. Cars were hit by artillery. People were killed by landmines. Some simply broke down on the road and had to continue on foot, carrying whatever they could, abandoning everything else. Those who made it out brought stories that shocked the world. They described conditions that seemed medieval: starvation, disease, bodies in the streets, people dying of cold and lack of medical care. They described indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas. They described terror, and they begged the world to do something, anything, to stop it. But the world, while sympathetic, did not intervene directly. Western nations provided weapons and economic sanctions, but no NATO troops were sent to Ukraine. The fear of direct confrontation with Russia, a nuclear power, outweighed the humanitarian imperative to protect civilians. This is the cold calculus of geopolitics. Principles are absolute until they conflict with perceived national interests. By the end of March, the estimates of civilian deaths in Mariupol ran into the thousands. Some Ukrainian officials suggested 5,000 or more, though exact figures were impossible to verify. The city was perhaps 80% destroyed. Most infrastructure was non-functional. And yet, resistance continued. Ukrainian forces still held parts of the city, most notably the Azovstal steel plant, and showed no signs of surrendering despite the hopeless situation. The Steel Fortress, April 1st of 10, 2022. The Azovstal Iron and Steel Works is one of the largest metallurgical plants in Europe. Sprawling across more than 10 square kilometers in southern Mariupol, the facility was built in the 1930s during Stalin's industrialization drive. It consists of enormous blast furnaces, rolling mills, coking facilities, and supporting infrastructure. A labyrinthine industrial complex of steel corridors, concrete bunkers, and underground tunnels. During the Cold War, Azovstal was designed with civil defense in mind. Beneath the surface facilities lies an extensive network of bomb shelters and underground passages built to protect workers and equipment in case of nuclear attack. These shelters, some located more than 20 meters underground, were designed to house thousands of people. They had reinforced concrete walls several meters thick, multiple levels, and their own ventilation systems. They were, in essence, an underground fortress. As Russian forces gradually overran the city proper, Ukrainian defenders fell back to Azovstal. By early April, this was the last major holdout in Mariupol. The defenders consisted primarily of elements of the Azov Regiment, Marines from the 36th Brigade, border guards, police, and territorial defense volunteers. The exact number is uncertain, but estimates suggest between 2,000 and 2,500 fighters, along with perhaps 1,000 or more civilians who had taken refuge in the plant. The defenders transformed Azovstal into a fortress. They established defensive positions in the industrial structures using the steel framework and concrete walls as cover. They stockpiled ammunition and supplies in the underground shelters. They established command posts and field hospitals in the depths of the complex. They prepared for a prolonged siege. Russian forces surrounded Azovstal completely, cutting it off from the rest of the city. They brought in heavy artillery and began systematically pounding the facility. The bombardment was intense and constant. High explosive shells, incendiary munitions, thermobaric weapons, anything that might break the defenders' will. The industrial structures that had once produced steel now burned under the onslaught. But the defenders held. From their positions they could see the Russian forces surrounding them. They could see the artillery firing. They could see tanks and armoured vehicles moving in the ruins of the city. And they could do little but endure and hope that their resistance mattered, that it was tying down Russian forces, that it was buying time for Ukraine elsewhere. The conditions inside Azovstal were grim, but better than in the city's basements. The defenders had some supplies. They had medical personnel and equipment, though limited. They had weapons and ammunition. They had structure and purpose. And crucially, they had the underground shelters, which offered protection from all but the most powerful weapons. The civilians sheltering in Azovstal, women, children, elderly people, were in an ambiguous and terrifying situation. They were protected from the shelling by the plant's structure and the presence of defenders. But they were also trapped in an active combat zone, in a facility that was the primary target of massive bombardment. They lived underground in the darkness, listening to explosions above, not knowing when or if they would ever leave. Communication between the defenders and the outside world was sporadic. Sometimes they could get brief satellite internet connections, sometimes radio contact with Ukrainian forces outside the city. Through these tenuous links, they sent messages describing their situation, requesting support, affirming their determination to continue fighting. These messages became important for Ukrainian morale and international awareness. The defenders of Azovstal became symbols of Ukrainian resistance, of defiance against overwhelming odds, of the refusal to surrender even when defeat seems inevitable. Russian forces made several demands for surrender during this period, offering safe passage if the defenders would lay down their arms. These offers were refused. The defenders knew what happened to prisoners in this war. They had heard the reports of torture and execution. They had seen the mass graves. Surrender might mean death, might mean being used for propaganda, might mean being sent to Russia as prisoners. Better to fight and perhaps die with purpose than to surrender and face an uncertain fate. By April 10th, after nearly a month and a half of siege, the city of Mariupol outside Azovstal had largely fallen. Russian forces controlled most of the urban area. The humanitarian crisis had reached catastrophic proportions. But inside the steel plant, the defense continued. The battle for Mariupol was entering its final phase, but it was far from over. Chandra. The World Watches, April 11th, 2022. In an age of instant communication and ubiquitous smartphones, the siege of Mariupol unfolded before the eyes of the world in a way that sieges of the past did not. Despite the city being cut off, Despite the destruction of infrastructure, despite the chaos and violence, information still flowed out. Videos emerged showing destroyed neighborhoods, bodies in the streets, desperate civilians. Satellite images revealed the extent of destruction. Survivors who escaped told their stories to journalists, and from inside Azovstal, defenders sent messages and occasionally videos, showing their determined faces, their makeshift living conditions, their refusal to give up. This visibility created a strange dynamic. On one hand, the world knew what was happening. Politicians condemned the siege. News media covered it extensively. Citizens in countries around the world held rallies in support of Ukraine. The International Criminal Court opened investigations into possible war crimes. Human rights organizations documented atrocities. On the other hand, the world's attention did not translate into effective intervention. No military forces came to break the siege. No UN peacekeepers arrived. The fighting continued. The civilians suffered. The defenders held out. And everyone watching felt a mixture of admiration, horror, and helplessness. Within Ukraine, Mariupol became a rallying cry. Remember Mariupol appeared in graffiti, in social media posts, in speeches by President Zelensky. The city's suffering and resistance became part of the national narrative of the war, proof of Russian brutality and Ukrainian courage. The defenders, especially those in Azovstal, were celebrated as heroes, defenders of not just a city, but of Ukrainian identity and sovereignty. Internationally, debates raged about what could or should be done. Some called for more weapons to be sent to Ukraine. Some demanded harsher economic sanctions on Russia. Some argued for humanitarian intervention. But the fundamental problem remained. Direct military involvement by NATO nations risked escalation to a broader war, potentially even nuclear conflict. Leaders faced an impossible choice between the moral imperative to protect civilians and the pragmatic imperative to avoid World War III. Russia's narrative about Mariupol differed dramatically from the Ukrainian and international narrative. Russian media portrayed the defenders as neo-Nazis and nationalists who were using civilians as human shields. They claimed that Ukrainian forces, not Russian bombardment, were responsible for civilian casualties. They portrayed the siege as a liberation, freeing the city from nationalist oppression. These narratives, while contradicting the evidence and testimony available, were effective in Russia, where state-controlled media dominated and alternative information sources were restricted. Inside Azovstal, the situation was deteriorating. Supplies were running low. The wounded were piling up in the makeshift hospitals, suffering without adequate medical care. Food was scarce. Water was contaminated, and the bombardment continued relentlessly. The defenders knew they could not hold forever, but they also knew that every day they held Azovstal was a day that Russian forces were tied down, unable to advance elsewhere. During this period, there were renewed efforts to evacuate civilians from Azovstal. The UN and Red Cross attempted to negotiate humanitarian corridors. After several failed attempts, small-scale evacuations did occur. On April 20th, some civilians managed to leave the plant and reach Ukrainian-controlled territory. They brought out stories of life underground. Families, huddled in the darkness, children who had not seen sunlight in weeks, people surviving on minimal food and water, all while listening to the constant explosions above. These evacuations provided some relief, but hundreds of civilians and more than 2,000 defenders remained in the plant. And the siege continued. The Endgame. April 21-30, 2022. By late April, the siege of Mariupol had become a battle of wills. Russian forces had every material advantage: overwhelming numbers, artillery, air power, supplies. The defenders had only their determination, their defensive positions, and the shelter of Azovstal's underground facilities. It was a siege within a siege, the steel plant surrounded within the surrounded city. The Russian strategy evolved. After weeks of bombardment had failed to dislodge the defenders, they shifted tactics. They began using thermobaric weapons, vacuum bombs, designed to create massive overpressure and consume oxygen in enclosed spaces. These weapons were particularly terrifying in an underground facility, where the blast wave could travel through corridors and the oxygen depletion could suffocate those in sealed chambers. The defenders adapted as best they could. They sealed off sections of the underground complex. They rotated fighters to give everyone time to rest. They continued to treat wounded with diminishing medical supplies. They rationed food and water. And they sent messages to the outside world, describing their situation and affirming their determination to continue. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke repeatedly about the defenders of Mariupol in his nightly addresses to the nation. He called them heroes. He said that their sacrifice was giving Ukraine time and that they would be remembered. He also hinted at the grim reality. We are doing everything to find any way, any chance to save our people in Mariupol. The most influential world leaders are involved in a possible evacuation. I will not disclose the details of these contacts because they are extremely sensitive. The phrase, possible evacuation, was telling. It suggested that military relief was impossible, that the defenders were doomed, and that the best outcome that could be hoped for was somehow negotiating their safe passage out. But even this seemed unlikely given Russian positions and stated intentions. Inside Azovstal, morale remained remarkably high given the circumstances. The defenders knew they had become symbols of Ukrainian resistance. They knew the world was watching. They knew their families were praying for them. And they knew that, even if they could not win, they could refuse to lose. They could deny Russia an easy victory, could force them to pay a price for every meter of ground. The civilians remaining in Azovstal were in the most precarious position. They were not combatants but were trapped in a combat zone. International law requires belligerents to allow civilians to leave conflict zones, but in practice, this was nearly impossible to implement. The defenders wanted civilians to leave to reduce the humanitarian burden and to avoid them being used as bargaining chips. The civilians wanted to leave but feared what awaited them in Russian-controlled territory. And Russian forces alternated between offering safe passage and continuing bombardment. Additional small-scale evacuations occurred during this period, coordinated with the UN and Red Cross. Convoys of buses would approach the plant during temporary ceasefires, and groups of civilians, dozens at a time, would emerge from the underground shelters blinking in the sunlight after weeks in darkness and board the buses. These evacuations were tense, both sides watchful, weapons at ready, knowing that a single shot could restart full combat. The evacuees brought out stories that further documented the humanitarian catastrophe. They described people dying from lack of medical care, children traumatized and malnourished, elderly people barely clinging to life. They described the sound of bombardment echoing through the steel corridors, the fear that each explosion might be the one that brought the structure down on top of them. They described praying, crying, hoping, and above all, trying to maintain some semblance of humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. By the end of April, roughly 1,000 civilians had been evacuated from Azovstal. But more than 2,000 defenders remained, along with perhaps 200 civilians who either could not leave or chose to stay. The siege was entering its third month. The city of Mariupol, outside the plant, was firmly under Russian control. The Ukrainian flag still flew over Azovstal, but everyone knew It was only a matter of time before it came down. The final days, May 4 to 16, 2022 May, brought spring to the Azov Sea coast. In normal years, this would be when Mariupol's beaches would begin to fill with people enjoying the warming weather. Flowers would bloom in the parks. The city would come alive after the long winter. But in May 2022, Mariupol was a ruin, a ghost city of destroyed buildings and buried bodies, occupied by Russian forces and haunted by the memory of what it had been. Inside Azovstal, the situation had become untenable. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Water was scarce and contaminated. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded fighters lay in makeshift hospitals, without painkillers, without antibiotics, without anesthesia. The smell of death permeated the underground corridors, and still the bombardment continued day after day, night after night. Shells and bombs falling on a facility that had already been reduced to rubble on the surface. The defenders faced a decision that no soldier wants to make: when to surrender. Military honor says you fight until you cannot fight, until ammunition is exhausted, until you are dead or incapacitated. But military reality says that pointless death is not heroic, that preserving your soldiers' lives for future battles can be the right choice. The defenders of Azovstal had already exceeded all reasonable expectations. They had held for nearly 80 days against overwhelming odds. They had tied down significant Russian forces. They had become international symbols of resistance. What more could be asked of them? On May 6th, the final large group of civilians, about 100 people, was evacuated from Azovstal. This was both a relief and a burden. Relief because innocent people were removed from immediate danger. Burden because the defenders could no longer cite civilian protection as a reason to continue holding out. The question now was starkly simple: surrender or die. Ukrainian authorities began carefully preparing the public for the inevitable. President Zelensky stated that the priority was saving the lives of the defenders. Military officials spoke of heroes who had done everything possible. The language was carefully chosen to frame a surrender not as a defeat, but as a strategic decision, not as failure, but as having fulfilled their mission. This framing was important for national morale and for the defenders' own sense of honor. Behind the scenes, negotiations were occurring. Through various intermediaries, the UN, the Red Cross, Turkey, even Israel, discussions were held about the terms of a surrender. The Ukrainian side wanted guarantees that the defenders would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, that they would be held in decent conditions, that they would eventually be exchanged. The Russian side was less clear about their intentions. Some Russian officials suggested the defenders would be tried as war criminals or terrorists. Others suggested they would be used for prisoner exchanges. Inside Azovstal, the defenders debated. Some wanted to fight to the death, better to die free than surrender to an uncertain fate. Others argued that survival gave them a chance to fight again, to see their families again, to bear witness to what had happened. It was an intensely personal decision that each fighter had to make: surrender and live as a prisoner, or resist and likely die. On May 16, 2022, after 82 days of siege, the first group of defenders began to surrender. They emerged from the underground shelters, wounded, exhausted, bearded, and gaunt. They were searched, documented, photographed by Russian forces, then loaded onto buses. More followed over the next few days. By May 20th, the last defender had surrendered. The siege of Mariupol was over. The exact number of defenders who surrendered is uncertain. Ukrainian sources suggest around 2,400 fighters. They were taken to various facilities in Russian-controlled territory. Their fate would become a matter of ongoing concern and negotiation. Some would later be exchanged in prisoner swaps. Some would die in captivity. Some would remain prisoners for years. And one facility holding many of them, a detention center in Olenivka, would be hit by an explosion in July 2022, killing dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war. The circumstances of that explosion remain disputed and controversial. The aftermath. Counting the cost. The siege of Mariupol lasted approximately 85 days, from late February through mid-May 2022. In that time, a thriving city of 450,000 people was reduced to ruins. The exact death toll will likely never be known with certainty. Ukrainian officials estimate at least 25,000 civilians died, though some suggest the number could be higher. Russian sources claim much lower numbers, but they have not provided credible documentation. Thousands more were wounded. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, becoming refugees in other parts of Ukraine or in European countries. The city's infrastructure was devastated. According to post-battle assessments, approximately 90% of buildings were damaged or destroyed. The port facilities, crucial for economic activity, were destroyed. The AU steel plants, Azovstal and Ilyich, were severely damaged, their production capacity eliminated. Water, electrical and gas systems were destroyed. Schools, hospitals, administrative buildings, all were damaged or destroyed. The estimated cost of reconstruction runs into tens of billions of dollars. The cultural heritage of Mariupol was also lost. The drama theatre, the regional history museum, churches, monuments, many were destroyed or damaged. Digital and physical archives were lost. Art collections were destroyed or looted. The city's Greek community, which had maintained its distinct identity for more than 2 centuries, was scattered to the winds. The psychological trauma is immeasurable but undeniably vast. Everyone who survived the siege carries those 85 days with them. Children who spent their formative months in basements, listening to explosions. Parents who watched their children go hungry. Elderly people who saw their entire lives, their homes, their neighborhoods, their communities, destroyed. Fighters who made life and death decisions daily, who saw their comrades killed, who surrendered and faced an uncertain fate. For those who escaped Mariupol, life as refugees brought its own challenges, adjusting to new places, new languages, new lives, dealing with trauma without adequate mental health support, worrying about those left behind, feeling guilty for having survived when others did not. Trying to explain to friends and family in peaceful countries what it was like, knowing that words are inadequate to convey such experiences. Russian forces, having captured Mariupol, claimed victory and began efforts to incorporate the city into their control. They cleared rubble, restored some basic services, and began limited reconstruction. They installed Russian-backed authorities, introduced the Russian ruble as currency, and attempted to Russify the population. But the city they controlled was a shell, a corpse, a memorial to their own brutality. Internationally, Mariupol became a symbol. Human rights organizations documented the siege as an example of violations of international humanitarian law, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, use of prohibited weapons, siege tactics that target civilian populations. The International Criminal Court continued investigations. Mariupol entered the lexicon of modern warfare alongside Guernica, Stalingrad, Aleppo, Grozny, cities whose names evoke not just places, but atrocities. Mariupol in historical context. The siege of Mariupol was not unique in military history. Urban sieges have been a feature of warfare since ancient times. Humans have always sought the protection of fortified settlements, and armies have always sought to capture them. What makes each siege notable is not the tactic itself, but the specific circumstances, the strategic stakes, the humanitarian impact, the political context, and how it is remembered. In some ways, Mariupol echoes historical sieges. The defense of Azovstal recalls Masada, the Jewish fortress that held out against Roman forces in 73-74 CE, with defenders choosing resistance over surrender. It echoes the siege of Leningrad in World War II, where a Soviet city endured nearly 900 days of German siege, with massive civilian casualties from starvation and bombardment. It echoes more recent urban battles like Aleppo in the Syrian civil war, where a major city was systematically destroyed through siege and bombardment. But Mariupol also had unique features. It occurred in the context of a war between two modern militaries, with sophisticated weapons and real-time communications. It occurred in the era of social media and ubiquitous documentation, with the siege being televised and live-streamed in unprecedented ways. It occurred in a conflict that threatened to escalate into a broader great power confrontation, making international intervention fraught with risk. The siege also revealed much about contemporary warfare. It showed that despite advanced technology, precision weapons, drones, satellite intelligence, urban warfare remains brutal and destructive. It showed that sieges remain effective military tactics, albeit at enormous humanitarian cost. It showed that international humanitarian law, while important, is difficult to enforce when great powers are involved. And it showed that civilian suffering in war remains immense, regardless of how much the world knows about it. Memory and meaning for Ukraine, Mariupol has become a symbol of both Russian aggression and Ukrainian resistance. The city's defenders, especially those in Azovstal, are celebrated as heroes. Streets and schools in other Ukrainian cities have been renamed in honor of Mariupol. Memorials have been erected. The date of the theatre bombing, March 16th, is commemorated. Survivors give testimony, ensuring that what happened is not forgotten. The phrase, "Remember Mariupol," carries multiple meanings. It is a call to remember the city as it was before the war, a vibrant, multicultural place where people lived ordinary lives. It is a call to remember the atrocities committed there, to seek accountability and justice. It is a call to remember the defenders and their courage. And it is a call to ensure that what happened in Mariupol does not happen elsewhere, that the international community learns from this tragedy. For those who lived through the siege, memory is more complicated and personal. It is not about symbolism or national narratives, but about surviving trauma, about grief and loss, about trying to rebuild lives from ruins. Many survivors struggle with PTSD, depression, anxiety. They wake from nightmares of explosions. They flinch at loud noises. They cannot talk about their experiences without breaking down. This is the human reality behind the historical event, the individual suffering that statistics cannot capture. The children who survived Mariupol will carry the siege with them for their entire lives. It will shape who they become, how they view the world, how they understand safety and danger. Psychologists working with these children document symptoms of severe trauma: nightmares, anxiety, behavioral problems, difficulty trusting adults. The full impact will unfold over decades as these children grow into adults who were shaped by having their childhood interrupted by war. There are also unresolved questions about memory and justice. Will there be accountability for what happened in Mariupol? Will those responsible for civilian casualties, for targeting hospitals and theatres, for siege tactics that constitute war crimes, ever face justice? International law provides mechanisms: the International Criminal Court, tribunals, sanctions, But enforcing these against powerful states is notoriously difficult. The people of Mariupol deserve justice, but whether they will receive it remains uncertain. The strategic aftermath. From a purely military strategic perspective, the siege of Mariupol had significant consequences for the broader war. The Russian capture of Mariupol secured a land bridge between Russia and occupied Crimea, achieving one of the early war's strategic objectives. It freed up Russian forces that had been tied down in the siege to be deployed elsewhere. And it eliminated a major Ukrainian defensive position along the Azov coast. However, the siege also imposed costs on Russia. It took much longer than they anticipated. The initial plan was likely to capture the city within days or weeks, not months. It consumed enormous amounts of ammunition and resources. It caused significant Russian casualties, though exact figures are disputed. And it tied down forces that could not be used in other offensives during those crucial first months of the war, when Russian forces were overextended across multiple fronts. For Ukraine, while losing Mariupol was a significant military defeat, the defense of the city had value. The prolonged resistance delayed Russian advances elsewhere. It degraded Russian forces and consumed their resources. It boosted Ukrainian morale and international support. The defenders became symbols that helped sustain national resistance. In this sense, while Mariupol fell, its defense was not without strategic purpose. The siege also influenced international support for Ukraine. The images and stories from Mariupol hardened Western resolve to support Ukraine with weapons and sanctions. Countries that had been hesitant to provide certain weapons systems reconsidered. Economic sanctions on Russia intensified. Humanitarian aid increased. Public opinion in Western countries solidified in support of Ukraine. Mariupol became evidence of Russian war crimes that justified continued and expanded support. Living in the ruins. In the months and years after the siege, Mariupol remains under Russian occupation. The occupying authorities have made efforts to rebuild, but progress is slow and limited. Some residents have returned either because it is their home and they have nowhere else to go, or because they lived through the siege and survived and cannot bring themselves to abandon the city. Others stay away, unable to return to a place of such trauma or unwilling to live under Russian occupation. Life in post-siege Mariupol is strange and difficult. The city functions at a minimal level. Some services have been restored, water and electricity in some areas, basic food supplies, emergency medical care. But much of the city remains in ruins. Entire neighborhoods are still rubble. Unexploded ordnance remains a danger. Buildings that appear intact are structurally unsound. The port, once bustling with economic activity, sits damaged and underused. The population is a fraction of what it was. Of the pre-war 450,000 residents, perhaps 100,000, 150,000 remain, though figures are uncertain and fluctuate. The demographics have changed dramatically. Many of those who remain are elderly people who had nowhere else to go. The young and middle-aged, those with resources and options, mostly left. The result is a hollowed-out city. Demographically imbalanced, economically devastated, psychologically traumatized. Russian authorities have imposed their control. Russian curriculum in schools teaching that Mariupol has been liberated from Ukrainian nationalism. Russian television and media controlling the information environment. Russian police and security services monitoring the population. Russian passports issued to residents, pressuring them to accept Russian citizenship. This is not just military occupation, but an attempt at cultural transformation, to make Mariupol Russian not just politically, but culturally and socially. Resistance to this transformation exists but is necessarily underground. People speak Ukrainian quietly in their homes. They preserve Ukrainian books and symbols in hidden places. They tell their children the truth about what happened, contradicting official narratives. They maintain contact with relatives who escaped to Ukraine or Europe. They wait and hope for the day when Mariupol will be Ukrainian again, though when that day will come, or if it will come, no one can say. Reflections on siege warfare. The siege of Mariupol raises fundamental questions about warfare in the 21st century. We live in an age of supposed precision weapons, of international law, of global communications, of humanitarian principles enshrined in countless treaties and conventions. Yet Mariupol showed that none of this prevented a massive civilian catastrophe unfolding over nearly 3 months while the world watched. Siege warfare is, by its nature, indiscriminate. When a city is surrounded and bombardment systematically destroys infrastructure, it is civilians who suffer most. Even if military targets are nominally being aimed at, the civilians trapped in the city have no escape, no protection, no way to avoid, becoming collateral damage. This is why siege warfare targeting civilian populations is considered a violation of international humanitarian law. But laws are only effective if enforced, and enforcement against powerful states is difficult. The siege also raises questions about resistance. When is continued resistance justified if it brings such suffering to civilians? The defenders of Mariupol made the decision to fight on, knowing that surrender would spare civilians immediate suffering, but might also lead to occupation, repression, and the loss of their city. This is an impossible moral calculation. How many lives is resistance worth? How much suffering is acceptable in pursuit of freedom? There are no easy answers, only tragic choices made in desperate circumstances. From a humanitarian perspective, the siege was a catastrophic failure of the international system. The mechanisms that exist to protect civilians in war, the Geneva Conventions, the UN Security Council, the International Criminal Court, proved inadequate. Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, could veto any UN action. The ICC could investigate, but not compel. Humanitarian organizations could document, but not prevent. And so the siege continued day after day, while diplomats debated and lawyers documented, and the world watched, but did not effectively intervene. The question this raises is uncomfortable. If the international system cannot prevent or stop atrocities when they are being documented in real time, what is the system for? What does it mean to have humanitarian law if it cannot protect the people of Mariupol? These are not questions with satisfying answers, but they are questions we must ask if we are serious about preventing future Mariupols. The defenders after surrender. The fate of Mariupol's defenders who surrendered from Azovstal remains an ongoing issue. They surrendered with the understanding, communicated through intermediaries, that they would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. This means humane treatment, adequate food and medical care, no torture or abuse, and eventual exchange or release when hostilities end. The reality has been more complicated. The defenders were taken to various detention facilities in Russian-controlled territory. Some were later exchanged in prisoner swaps between Ukraine and Russia, these complex negotiations where each side trades captured personnel. Those who were exchanged returned to Ukraine as heroes, welcomed with ceremonies, given medical treatment, reunited with families. They also bore witness to their experiences in captivity, some describing adequate treatment, others describing abuse and deprivation. Others remained in captivity. Some died there, from wounds sustained before surrender, from lack of medical care, or, in some cases, from apparent abuse. The explosion at the Olenivka detention center in July 2022, which killed dozens of Ukrainian POWs, including many from Azovstal, remains controversial. Russian authorities claim it was a Ukrainian attack. Ukrainian authorities claim it was either a Russian strike or an internal explosion designed to eliminate witnesses to abuses. The truth is unclear, but the result is undeniable. More defenders of Mariupol died even after surrender. Some defenders face or have faced trial in Russian or Russian-controlled courts on various charges: terrorism, war crimes, participating in illegal armed formations. These trials are widely seen as show trials, conducted without proper legal protections, with predetermined outcomes. International law is clear that prisoners of war should not be prosecuted for having participated in armed conflict. Combatant immunity protects soldiers from criminal charges for acts of war that are themselves lawful. But this protection requires that the detaining power respect international law, which appears not to be the case. For Ukraine and for the families of the defenders, their fate remains a priority. President Zelensky has repeatedly stated that securing the return of all prisoners, including the Azovstal defenders, is a key objective. Each prisoner exchange is celebrated when it includes Mariupol defenders, but many remain in captivity, their conditions uncertain, their future unclear. Ukraine. After Mariupol. The fall of Mariupol did not end the war in Ukraine. If anything, it hardened Ukrainian resolve. The city's suffering became motivation to resist elsewhere. They will not have another Mariupol became an implicit promise. Other Ukrainian cities would not be allowed to suffer the same fate. This meant accepting more military aid, preparing better defenses, evacuating civilians earlier from threatened areas. The war continued with varying fortunes. Russian forces, having captured Mariupol, shifted focus to the Donbass, attempting to capture the entire regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukrainian forces, reinforced by Western weapons, began counteroffensives that would recapture significant territory in late 2022 and early 2023. The conflict settled into a grinding attritional war with a shifting front line, neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Throughout this, Mariupol remained in Russian hands, but also in Ukrainian consciousness. Plans for eventual rebuilding were discussed, though with the understanding that this could only happen after Russian forces were expelled. Meanwhile, the city's refugees, scattered across Ukraine and Europe, carried Mariupol with them, maintaining its identity even in displacement, ensuring that the city would not be forgotten, even if it remained under occupation. The war's impact on Ukrainian national identity was profound, and Mariupol played a significant role in this transformation. Before 2022, Ukraine was a country with complex identities. Linguistic, regional, cultural differences were significant. The war, and particularly the experiences of cities, like Mariupol, created a more unified national identity forged in resistance to Russian aggression. Mariupol, with its historically Russian-speaking population that nevertheless fought fiercely for Ukraine, became proof that Ukrainian identity transcended language and ethnicity. It was about values, about choice, about refusing to submit to dictatorship. The larger picture: war in the modern age. Mariupol's siege occurred in a broader context: the return of great power conflict to Europe, the challenge to the post-Cold War international order, the question of whether might makes right in the 21st century. The siege was not just about one city, it was about whether territorial conquest through military force would be accepted by the international community. The response was mixed. Western nations rallied to Ukraine's support with weapons, money, and sanctions, but stopped short of direct military intervention. The global south was more divided, with many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America maintaining neutrality or even tilting toward Russia, motivated by historical relationships, economic interests, or resentment of Western dominance. The United Nations proved unable to take decisive action due to the Security Council's structure, giving veto power to permanent members, including Russia. This has led to questions about the future of international order. If international law and humanitarian principles cannot prevent or stop atrocities like Mariupol, if powerful states can act with relative impunity, if the international community is divided rather than united, what does this mean for future conflicts? Will other powerful states conclude that territorial expansion through force is viable? Will smaller countries conclude that they must develop their own deterrents, including nuclear weapons, because international guarantees are insufficient? These are the questions that historians and policymakers will grapple with for years. Mariupol is not just a historical event, but a test case, a precedent, a lesson about what is and is not possible in contemporary international relations. The lessons drawn from it will shape future conflicts and diplomatic strategies. A city in waiting. Today, Mariupol exists in a kind of limbo. It is occupied but not accepted as Russian by most of the international community. It is damaged but not completely destroyed. It is inhabited but by a fraction of its former population. It is being rebuilt but in the image of its occupiers, not its former self. The people of Mariupol, those who remain and those scattered in displacement, wait. They wait for the war to end. They wait for the possibility of return. They wait for justice. They wait for the city to be Ukrainian again. But waiting is not passive. It is an active choice to maintain hope, to preserve identity, to refuse to accept that the world of late February 2022 is gone forever. There is poetry in this waiting, a kind of stubborn endurance that mirrors the 85-day defense. The defenders held Azovstal, knowing they would likely not be victorious, but refusing to surrender easily. The displaced Mariupol residents maintain their identity, knowing they may not return soon, but refusing to give up their city. Both are acts of resistance against a force that seeks to erase not just military opposition, but the very idea of Ukrainian Mariupol. Whether Mariupol will be liberated, when it will be liberated, what state it will be in if it is liberated. These questions have no certain answers. The war continues. The front lines shift. The future remains unwritten. But what is certain is that Mariupol has been transformed from an ordinary city into a symbol, a story, a chapter in the larger narrative of the Ukraine war and of 21st century conflict. The human dimension, behind all the strategic analysis, the historical context, the political implications, there are individual human beings who lived through the siege of Mariupol. Their stories are the ones that matter most, even if they are the hardest to tell and the hardest to hear. There is the mother who gave birth in a basement by candlelight during the bombing, who wrapped her newborn in whatever clothing she could find, who fed the baby while she herself was starving. There is the elderly man who buried his wife in the yard because he could not reach a cemetery, who marked the spot with a piece of pipe because he had no wood for a cross, who talks to the grave every day. There is the teenager who spent her 16th birthday in a bomb shelter, who missed school and friends and the normal milestones of growing up, who now lives in a refugee center in Germany and dreams of going home. There is the doctor who performed surgery without anesthesia, holding patients down while they screamed, knowing he was causing agony but also saving lives. There is the soldier who fought for 85 days, who saw friends die, who made decisions that haunt him, who surrendered and spent months as a prisoner before being exchanged, who now struggles with PTSD and survivor's guilt. There is the volunteer who brought food and water to shelters every day, risking his life, motivated by simple human compassion, who died when a shell hit his car. These stories number in the hundreds of thousands. Every person who lived through the siege has a story, has trauma, has losses, has moments of horror, and moments of unexpected humanity. Collecting and preserving these stories is important work being done by journalists, historians, and memory organizations. These testimonies will be crucial for future understanding of what happened, for seeking justice, and for ensuring that the people of Mariupol are remembered as individuals, not just statistics. Lessons and questions. What can we learn from the siege of Mariupol? The question is deceptively simple, and the answers are multiple and complex. From a military perspective, the siege demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of modern siege warfare. It showed that determined defenders in prepared positions can hold out far longer than attackers might expect. It showed that urban combat remains costly even with technological advantages. It showed that sieges can achieve military objectives but at enormous cost in time, resources, and international opinion. From a humanitarian perspective, the siege demonstrated catastrophic failures in protecting civilian populations during warfare. It showed that existing international law and institutions are insufficient to prevent atrocities when major powers are involved. It showed that civilian suffering in modern warfare remains immense despite all our technology and supposed civilization. From a political perspective, the siege demonstrated the complexities of international response to aggression. It showed that while international support can be mobilized, direct military intervention faces significant barriers. It showed that economic sanctions and weapons supplies are important, but have limits. It showed that the international system remains essentially based on the state's sovereignty and power, not universal humanitarian principles. But beyond these abstract lessons are more immediate, personal questions. How do we prevent future Mariupols? How do we provide justice for Mariupol's victims? How do we help survivors heal? How do we ensure that the world remembers and cares? These are not questions with clear technical solutions, but moral imperatives that require sustained commitment. Closing thoughts. Bearing witness. We have spent these past hours together examining the siege of Mariupol, its context, its unfolding, its consequences. We have tried to understand what happened, why it happened, what it means. We have looked at strategic considerations and humanitarian catastrophes, at political context and personal stories. We have tried to comprehend 85 days that transformed a city and became a defining moment in a larger war. But ultimately, words are inadequate to fully convey what happened in Mariupol. No narrative, however detailed, can truly capture the experience of living through those 85 days. No analysis, however insightful, can substitute for the testimony of those who were there. No history can bring back the dead, heal the traumatized, or restore what was destroyed. What we can do is bear witness. We can listen to the stories of survivors. We can document what happened as accurately and completely as possible. We can honor the memory of those who died. We can support those who lived. We can work to ensure that such atrocities become less likely in the future. And we can remember the city as it was, remember what was done to it. Remember that every statistic represents a human being with dreams and fears and loved ones. The 85-day siege of Mariupol in the spring of 2022 was one of the defining events of the Russia-Ukraine war. It was a humanitarian catastrophe, a military confrontation, a symbol of resistance, a war crime, a tragedy on a massive scale. It was also a story of human endurance, courage, compassion, and suffering. It was history unfolding in real time before the eyes of the world, and it is history that we are still processing, still trying to understand, still living with the consequences of. For the people of Mariupol, those who died, those who survived, those who remain, those who fled, the siege is not history. It is lived experience, ongoing trauma, persistent reality. They do not have the luxury of analyzing it from a distance. They carry it with them every day. They deserve our respect, our support, our commitment to justice, and our promise to remember. As we conclude this documentary, take a moment of silence for Mariupol, for the city that was, for the people who died, for those who fought and defended, for those who suffered and survived, for those who wait and hope. Remember them. Remember their city. Remember what happened there in the spring of 2022, because remembering is the first step toward ensuring it does not happen again. And if we cannot prevent it from happening again, at least we will know what we have failed to prevent. Mariupol endured 85 days of siege. The city fell, but its story continues. The buildings were destroyed, but the memory remains. The defenders surrendered, but they were not defeated. The people were displaced, but they remain people of Mariupol, carrying their city with them wherever they go. This is their story. This is Mariupol's story. This is a story that needed to be told. Thank you for listening. Good night. This documentary is dedicated to the people of Mariupol, past, present, and future. May they know peace. May they know justice. May they know home again.